Good evening. Welcome to the Adventurers Club of Los Angeles. My name is Rich Mayfield, member 1211. We're here tonight with our guest, Rod Pyle, virtually. This is our first virtual setup. Thank you for being here, Rod.
My pleasure.
So we're broadcasting live, Rod. People will comment in the chat. So if you have questions for Rod, make sure that you're throwing those questions in the chat so we can answer those at the end. And if you like our channel, don't forget to like and subscribe. So, Rod, you are here to talk to us tonight about space stations, past, present, future, everything space stations. So before we kind of get into the nitty gritty, can you tell me, like, what was the first time, how did you get into space? Like, what sparked your interest in space stations and all things space?
Well, being my age, it's different than what excites people now because I'm really old. But I was born about a year before NASA was. So 1956, 57. And it was a very exciting time to grow up. I became aware of the American space program in the mid 60s, probably towards the end of the Gemini program. And then I was just an Apollo fanatic. So my parents were understanding or inattentive enough, depending on how you look at it, that I got to stay home during all the moonwalks. And it was just a magical time because these missions were going off to explore the moon sometimes as often as every 2 months. When you think of that from today's perspective, it's kind of hard to believe. I have trouble believing it now sometimes myself because these guys were flying right on the edge of what the technology could do with any level of safety. And the margins were like this. They had lots of redundancy, they had backups, but there are all these single points of failure, like if the engine in the lunar module doesn't light up, you don't leave the moon, you stay there. If the engine on the Apollo spacecraft doesn't light up, you stay in lunar orbit, you don't come home. So it was just an incredible time to be alive. And then shortly after the Apollo program shut down, there was going to be a lull, and we all knew it, between that and the space shuttle, which started in 1981. But Skylab flew, and that was the first American space station. And I had followed, of course, the exploits of the Russian space stations, which have been flying since 1971. But Skylab was really quite impressive. Of course, part of it was we just got more news about it because the Russians at the time didn't let a lot of news escape to the West, except for the big proclamative headlines of we've had yet another incredible success for the motherland.
Right.
But Skylab to follow was really an exciting thing, especially because, as I'll go into later, it had problems when it arrived in orbit, and they had to do some very heroic things to get it fixed. So I think that all got me started on this road to permanent geekdom in the space trade.
Right. So I want to mention too that you're the editor-in-chief of Ad Astra magazine. Is that right?
I happen to have one right here.
And
yes.
I'll tell, like, if you guys haven't seen Ad Astra, can you hold that up again just so everybody can see that?
Yeah.
This is a beautiful magazine. I mean, probably one of the most visually stunning magazines that I've ever looked at. Right.
Thank you.
And it's National Space Society. Can you tell us a little bit about Ad Astra and what its mission is?
Yeah, I took over about 3 years ago. The magazine is about a third longer than it was then. It's printed on much higher quality stock, and I've really tried to transform it into something that's market competitive. So as of today, it's available only to members of the National Space Society, which is $50 a year, and you can see all the info on them by going to space.nss.org on the web. But we are selling digital subscriptions to this starting in the next month, and then it will be on newsstands starting in the new year. So it's about 64 pages each edition. We do a special 100-page edition every year. And we only have about 5 ads because, you know, when you're part of a special interest group like this, you don't have tons of people that want to advertise. So that's great for me because I get to fill all the pages with great graphic spreads and really cool stories. So it's a lot of fun.
That's interesting. So who you do have 5 ads in there, not to give them free advertising, but who are the 5 people that advertise and how does that work?
They're people mostly from the space advocacy community. So the Heinlein Trust, which is formed from the estate of Robert Heinlein, the science fiction author, usually has an ad in there. Sometimes we have some ads for our own members for things that they're doing. We often have ads for books. I carry an ad in there for some of my books. I kind of rotate through the 15 of them to see which one will sell. And occasionally we get something from an outside group, a university or a university press, something of that nature, but it's all kind of trade oriented. We're starting to branch out. We're talking to a couple of automotive companies, interestingly enough, that seem to want to buy a back cover. So, but I like keeping the ad load down because it leaves us a lot more room. Because if you looked during the Apollo anniversary last year, if you went to the newsstand and looked at all those special editions, they're about 40 pages. They're printed on really crummy paper, and they're 40% advertising.
Yeah.
So you open it up, and the subscription cards fall out, and you're looking at ad after ad for, AARP and all this stuff. And I thought, I don't want my magazine to look like that. So I've been very fortunate.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, I love the magazine. It like I said, it's beautiful. I love thumbing through it. The layout's amazing. So, anyway, but let's talk about space stations because that's kind of your area of expertise, right? So, I guess we'll just start in the beginning. First space station, first conception. Where did we come up with this idea of like we're going to put a space station up there as opposed to just fly stuff around in orbit?
Space stations had been on the mind of the scientific community since the early 1900s, early to mid 1900s. Are you ready for me to bring up some slides?
Oh yeah,
okay.
Anytime.
Let's bring up slide 1, if we could.
Slide 1 is up.
You got it.
All right. This is the International Space Station in all its glory. It's a modular station. It took a number of years to build. And it's been continuously occupied in orbit for 20 years now. A lot of people don't realize that. It's been there for a long time. It's an old, aging machine, the most complicated machine ever built, the biggest machine ever built. And that includes anything for the military. But it's really the culmination of 50 years of effort. So we've been flying space stations for 50 years. Early on, the Russians took a lead in that area as the Soviet Union because they had plenty of big rockets to use, and they were losing the race to the moon to the United States, so they decided to refocus their efforts on Earth orbital space stations, which was easier to accomplish. So let's take a look at how this all began and how we think it's going to extend to the future. Bring up slide 2, please. So people have thought about being in space for a long time, but mostly traveling there. Living came as a later idea. So this is a picture of Chinese Emperor Wan Hu. Who, you might ask? Wan Hu. Chuckle, chuckle. He lived sometime between 2000 BC and 600 AD. We're not really sure, but he wanted to go into space, and he thought, hey, I'm emperor. I should be able to do what I want. So he had his poor lackeys, his minions, attach a whole bunch of rockets to his throne, and probably realizing they would never have a job in the imperial court again, they followed his instructions, lit the fuses, and as the legend has it, he disappeared. Now, we don't know if he flew into orbit or just vaporized, but one way or another, Wan Hu was never seen again, and that was our first expedition. But getting serious about it, Jules Verne was really the first thinker that I think popularized notions of space travel. And he didn't really look at space stations, but he did look at how we might get to the moon and back. And of course, as you remember the story, it was a big bullet-shaped spacecraft that was fired out of a cannon. Go ahead and go to slide 3, and you'll see that. And it was put together by the Baltimore Gun Club, which I loved. I was reading that book. I thought, this is perfect. It's like the early version of the NRA says, hey, we're going to send a guy to the moon in a giant cannon shell. Now, of course, we know today, if you did that the occupants would have been a little smear of red jelly on the back of it because of the acceleration. By the time it made a certain amount of sense, this was 1865. And interestingly, they built the cannon that launched this in Florida in this book, just down the street from where the Kennedy Space Center is today.
So they actually built this cannon?
No. I mean, in the book.
Oh, okay.
They built the cannon, but it was located in Florida, right down from Cape Canaveral. And I thought, oh, that's really neat. That's looking ahead. But let's go to slide 4. First space station was in a book 4 years later written by Edward Everett Hale, who wasn't really known for writing science fiction or space lore. But he wrote a book called novella, actually. It was serialized in a magazine called The Brick Moon. So you should be seeing the brick moon right now. It's a 200-foot diameter sphere made out of bricks that was accidentally, quote unquote, launched with people on board. It was supposed to be a navigation beacon, but apparently the folks that were working on it accidentally got sealed in there. That concrete hardens pretty fast when you're mortaring bricks. And the next thing they knew, they were up in space with palm trees and pets from the looks of it. So that was kind of a fanciful look. Let's go to slide 5. This is 1929. Now we're starting to get serious. So the brilliant Russian rocket scientist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky had started writing about how we might use rockets to get into space. He had thought up the rocket equation, which tells you how you're actually going to get the proper response out of the rocket to get where you need to go with the right amount of speed. So hinging off of that, just a few years later in 29, a gentleman named Hermann Polotnik, who was a Prussian military engineer, decided that he'd design a space station. So this is just on paper, of course, but he wrote a 188-page book with over 100 drawings of this big rotating space station. And this is really forward-looking because it's not just a big tin can in space, but he actually thought about putting something up there shaped like a wheel. It would spin at a low rate of RPMs and give just enough centrifugal force so that people standing on the outer rim of the hull would feel the effects of gravity, artificial gravity. He wrote about putting it in geostationary orbit, so it'd be up about 25,000 miles above the Earth, which is the point at which you're always looking at the same part of Earth because it's rotating, it's orbiting the planet at the same rate the planet's rotating. So you could look down on Austria or Germany or whatever you wanted to communicate with. He was going to have them communicate with the ground with mirrors using a heliograph. His radio he didn't think would carry far enough. And he had plans for living quarters and a mess hall, a machine room, an observatory, and a big mirror, which is that dish on the left side, which would be of the profile, which would generate power with a steam plant. So it was kind of primitive, but you know, the ideas were sound. He did look at the idea of using that mirror also to reflect light back to the Earth's surface to create artificial sunlight and potentially the militarization of space. I will add, a few years later, these ideas and some others from another German scientist were picked up on by the German war machine, who said, so let me get this right. You think you could put a big mirror in space and light up the Earth? And the scientists said, the engineers said, yeah. They said, well, could you focus the light enough that it would actually catch things on fire? And they said, yeah, maybe. So they actually started planning on paper, doing the calculations to use a larger version of von Braun's V2, hundreds of launches, to send up segments of a station that would probably not be a wheel like this. It would just be a big flat, basically farm of mirrors. And they'd worked out all these exotic thin alloys to make this giant mirror in space on the order of hundreds of meters across, that they would be able to focus. It would have a crew. It would actually have a crew of 20 German soldiers who would be up there in their little German knickers in space, and they would aim it at American cities and burn these big swaths through New York and Chicago and Los Angeles from space where they couldn't be touched by anybody. The part I thought was the most alluring was that they planned to generate oxygen and get their food from zero gravity pumpkin patches because they felt pumpkins were something that didn't particularly need dirt to grow, so that would be easy to do on a zero-G space station.
So for context, though, at this point when they were putting together all these plans, nobody had been to space yet, except for the Chinese emperor, who's probably still up there, right?
Probably up there in pieces.
But man had not orbited. We had not completed orbit. Nothing had orbited. No man-made objects had orbited the Earth at this point. But we had grand plans.
The atmosphere. This is 10 years before, or more than that, before Sputnik. This is like 1939. It's almost 20 years before Sputnik. So it was well ahead of its time. They had a lot of crazy space plans. I write about a lot of them in this book, Amazing Stories of the Space Age, because I just got fascinated by all these wacky plans that we never hear about. You know, German orbitable bombers that were going to drop atomic bombs on New York and all this stuff. But that's not space stations. Let's continue on with the space stations. Let's go to slide 6. So this is about 1952. Werner von Braun, who was the brilliant rocket designer from World War II in Germany, we went over and snatched him with about 150 of his closest buddies, mostly scientists and engineers, and brought him over to the U.S. and promptly moved them to the sands of New Mexico. And said, okay, keep flying those rockets. We want to develop them for the U.S. Army. So he did that for a number of years. While he was doing that and planning, hopefully, to go above and beyond, he came up with these ideas about how to build early version of a space shuttle that would go up to orbit and deliver cargo and come back, a moon ship. He designed a fleet of Mars ships that mostly would have worked, although there were some things we didn't know about Mars that would have caused them ultimately to crash because they had wings. But getting there and doing most of what they had to do was at least technologically feasible from what he worked out. But relevant to our story, he designed this space station that was later called the Wheel. And this was published in Collier's magazine in 1952-53, and then later presented through a cooperative agreement between them and the Disney company on the Tomorrowland show and later the Wonderful World of Disney. And they made these incredible films. And of course, they had, go to slide 7, they had von Braun on screen with his, very aristocratic Prussian accent talking about, we are going to send rockets to space and going to dominate the heavens and all that. So he had designed this incredible space station, kind of along the lines of that early one we saw by the gentleman Polotnik, except this is bigger. This is 250 feet across. It's got 3 decks. You would have a crew of 80 soldiers. It was also solar powered. You have a steam generator that would be driven by the sun's rays, concentrated by a mirror. Primarily science-based, but with some military applications. And it was just, again, a really forward-looking vision. Now, the problem here, you look at this thing and you think, okay, 250 feet across, how are you going to launch that? Because at that time, the biggest payload carrying in a rocket was about 10 feet wide and maybe 20 feet long, if that. So you'd have to launch it in very small pieces. Well, Uncle Werner was ahead of the game there. Let's go to slide 8. It was actually intended to be inflatable. So these sections that you see here, you should be looking at some orange sections that are being assembled into the big space wheel. These sections would collapse down. They were designed to be made out of synthetic rubber, be crammed in nose cones, then launched one at a time. And then astronauts would go up there and inflate them with air that they carry in tanks, and then assemble the station. So the government, NASA, actually hired the Goodyear Tire Company to design a prototype of this. And they put together a scale model of it on the ground and said, yeah, it'll work. They were concerned about micrometeorite punctures. There was also some concern. It's kind of funny when you read it, but there was a lot of hand-wringing about what if an astronaut's fooling around and he trips and punctures a side, it'll take off like a party balloon and leave orbit or something. Obviously, that would have been a problem because it would have been very robust. But it's really a very ingenious design. And interestingly, as these commercial companies are now coming into the world of space stations moving ahead, some of them are working on expandable or inflatable, if you want to put it that way, space station designs. So again, this was really ahead of its time, but really ambitious in the 1950s because we hadn't even flown a rocket out of the atmosphere yet. So something that was not destined to be.
So people have been dreaming of space stations since before we could even go to space. And they had the concept that, we're going to have to send stuff up piecewise because we're not going to be able to send something massive up at once. So they're already thinking ahead, even though we don't even have the technology to put something in orbit yet, huh?
That's right. And von Braun and his friends, when they would estimate the budgets for these things, they said, well, it wouldn't cost any more than the Berlin airlift, for instance, which was, billions and billions of dollars. And when you're in a government in the 1950s in the US and you're hearing these numbers, you're thinking, what are you thinking? And you'd say, well, it'd probably only take a couple hundred flights of the rocket to assemble it in orbit. Well, that's a lot of flights when you've never done it once, right? But he was ever the optimist. But these plans didn't go anywhere. So we go to the 1960s. Let's put up slide 9. The United States Air Force was very concerned about developments in the Soviet Union and elsewhere in the Soviet sphere of influence with missile bases for obvious reasons because we were in the midst of the Cold War. And they were concerned about what we were doing. So both countries started working on crewed space stations that would be able to peer down on the bad guys, the other side, right? So this is a picture of the Air Force's manned orbiting laboratory. It's basically a big cylindrical can with a Gemini capsule on the front. It'd be launched in one piece in a rocket. And that capsule, now the Gemini program flew between the Mercury program and the Apollo program. But the military wanted to repurpose that capsule for military purposes. They put a hatch in the heat shield. So when you got to orbit with this thing, the 2 astronauts in the Gemini capsule would open this hatch, climb back in this space station, and live there for about a month. And you don't see it here in this image, but the side of it would open up, and they had this big telescope in it. I think the aperture was over 3 feet, which they would be able to use to spy on Soviet military installations, both in the Soviet Union and in the Soviet bloc. The problem was it was very expensive, and although we had been in orbit with the Mercury program at this point, this is about 1964-65, we hadn't done anything anywhere near this ambitious, and robotics at that point in space were not doing real well, but they were coming along real quickly because we had this unmanned exploration of the solar system going on. So about the time this program really started picking up steam in the late 60s, the satellites were getting so good that the Air Force said, we just don't need this thing.
You didn't need to have people up there to aim the
prototypes.
cameras.
Yeah, they built prototypes. They had tested a capsule with a hatch in the heat shield, flown it unmanned. They had done all kinds of developed spacesuits. They had astronauts recruited. Some of the astronauts that ended up on Apollo came from this program. But it just wasn't to be, and unfortunately it was shut down. I say unfortunately because, it was only a few years later that space stations started flying, but it really was very well worked out and would have put people up there for a month at a time to do some basic research in space, but again, not to be. Let's go to slide 10. About the same time, the Russians are over on the other side of this world saying, those Amerikanskis, we don't trust them. We have to get a look at their military installations. They were at that point still trying to beat us to the moon with their large N-1 rocket and their Soyuz spacecraft, but that program wasn't going well and it was falling behind schedule. Tests weren't working out as they liked. So very slowly they began to refocus on doing space stations themselves because they felt that was something that they could achieve because they had plenty of rockets and plenty of hardware. They just didn't have the expertise and the funding to be able to get out to the moon and back like we did. So starting in the mid-1960s, they began building these space stations. They were at first called Almaz. That was the military designation. Later, they became known as the Salyut. And it was an allegedly civilian space station with quotes. And for the most part, it was. First flew in 1971, and it was crewed by 3 cosmonauts for almost a month. Very successful, very robust. Unfortunately, their crew was killed when they re-entered because their capsule depressurized suddenly. But it was proof of concept. So they flew a bunch more of them. And there's an interesting side story here. Go to slide 11. 6 of these Salyut/Almaz stations flew successfully, all with crews. The first military-only flight was called Salyut 3, and it was really a thinly veiled attempt to both spy on the U.S. with people, like we had wanted to do to them, and test some military technology. They were so paranoid about what the Apollo hardware that the United States had could do that they actually, on this one station, installed a machine gun on the back end. So this is a picture of that. It's a repurposed machine gun from the back end of a Soviet bomber that would fire 23 millimeter projectiles. You can see them down the bottom left. And it was hard fixed the station. Now you didn't have a machine gunner back there. You had to orient the whole station towards whatever the incoming threat was. And they really wanted to test it, but the cosmonauts are up there and they said, guys, they're talking to the Russian Mission Control saying, this thing is it's lightweight. I mean, this is a spacecraft. It's not heavy. It's not massive. And we're really kind of concerned about what's going to happen when you fire that gun off. So they said, okay, we'll fire it after you leave. So they got in their spacecraft, they left. And then by remote control, they fired this thing. I think they fired 20 or 25 rounds. It was successful. Kind of shoved the station over because action, reaction,
Right.
And we don't know if those bullets are still whizzing around up there or not, because unless they re-enter, they're still there getting ready to go slinging into somebody's spacecraft, but hopefully not. But, they did have some other accomplishments. That's kind of a fun side story. But besides setting all the records for spaceflight for a number of years in terms of duration, they also were able to master robotic docking. So they had uncrewed spacecraft that would go up, dock completely automatically with the space stations, deliver supplies, and then separate and re-enter, leaving the space station up there with fresh supplies of water and food and fuel and all that. So it was really a pretty amazing period for the Russian engineers. So what's happening in America? Well, we're winding down the Apollo program. Last flight was in 1972, but we still had all this hardware. We had a couple extra Saturn V's left over. We had a bunch of Apollo spacecraft left over. And they thought, they'd been thinking for a while, what's after Apollo? They knew the money was going to dry up because it started drying up in the mid-'60s once most of that stuff was built. So let's bring up slide 12. We started planning Skylab. Now, Skylab was really ingenious on a bunch of levels. I think the main thing that was clever about it was just the top stage of the Saturn V rocket, but instead of carrying fuel and boosting the astronauts off to the moon, they built a workshop in it. They built a laboratory and a habitat in it and used that as their space station.
So it was literally the same fuselage, but
same thing completely. They added some solar panels. They added a telescope up top, and then, of course, they dressed out the interior. Now, originally, they had thought that they'd have to have fuel in that because it would be so heavy that they'd need to fuel that stage. And then once the fuel was empty, the guys would go in and clean it out and install a bunch of stuff. They said, that's too complicated. Let's fly it dry. We'll just make it lighter. So it launched in 73, and it got into orbit successfully, but right away they started noticing something was wrong. They weren't getting enough voltage from the solar panels, and the temperatures were beginning to skyrocket, and were actually threatening the survival of the electronics inside because, this is 1973. They're not that far off of vacuum tubes at that point.
And how hot was it getting in there, like for reference?
Oh, it was getting up into the low hundreds.
Okay.
But enough that, things could go wrong. Plus, it's an enclosed space, so when all that plastic in there starts to heat up, it begins to outgas, and that can be toxic. It wasn't something they considered. They realized what had happened was when it launched, one of the solar panels got torn completely off during launch because of the violence of going up through the upper atmosphere. And a micrometeorite shield, which also was a heat shield, got torn off. And the other solar panel got snagged on some sheet metal. So they just had these 4 little solar panels that you see around the top of the thing that were picking up just enough power to keep it alive, but it was in trouble. So they did some very quick planning. So it was flown with no people in it. And the crews are going to be launched separately with a smaller Saturn rocket and the Apollo spacecraft. So they delayed for about 2 weeks, scrambled like crazy to develop solutions, and set up a crew that was commanded by Pete Conrad. And if you know anything about Pete Conrad, he was the buccaneer of the astronauts. He was a Navy guy who just, he had this real take no prisoners, gung-ho attitude. His crews loved him. So he and 2 other crew members flew up there with some hastily arranged fixes. So the first thing he did was pull up next to the space station, the Apollo spacecraft, open the hatch, reach out and try and tug the solar panel clear. That wouldn't work. And as Conrad later related, he said, we're banging a couple $1 million worth of Apollo spacecraft up against the space station. I'm terrified we're going to break it. So they gave up. They said, okay, we'll dock with it and fix it later. Well, they couldn't dock right away. It took 8 or 9 tries because the latches wouldn't fire because there was just so much stuff that had gotten messed up during that launch. But they finally docked, were able to transfer into it. They very quickly they had designed this Mylar parasol, which is that gold square you can see, that they put out through an airlock to cover the main part of the crew habitat. And that cut down the temperatures. But they still had a problem. None of the big solar panels were swung out. One was pinned against the side and one had been torn off completely. So that big solar panel you see perpendicular to it out to the right wasn't there. It was snugged up against the side. So Pete Conrad and Joe Kerwin got suited up and they went outside and they had, and I'm not kidding you, they had one of those poles that you use for snipping tree branches.
Yeah.
Got a long cable and a handle and a little blade on the end. They had modified that in sections and assembled it so that they could reach out and snip the offending sheet metal that was holding that solar panel captive.
So they were literally hanging out the door. They were hanging out the door of an Apollo capsule with a tree trimmer.
No, now the Apollo capsules docked
they docked it, right?
Actually opened another hatch, and they're walking around on top of the space station hull with tethers and hooks and stuff. So there's no counterbalancing. Their boots aren't fixed. They're not wearing magnetic boots or anything. They're just trying their best to keep from flying off the thing while they're trying to fix it. So they're working with this pole and they're snipping the metal and it starts to budge a little bit and it just wouldn't swing out. So finally, Pete Conrad crawls hand over hand on the snipper pole out to the edge of the solar panel, ties a rope, crawls back, ties a rope to a little D-ring they found in the space station. And they had trained, as much as they could in water and so forth with this, but this thing wasn't designed to be maintained. It was designed to be flown and used as is. So they had to, on the spur of the moment, find things to tie off to. So they tied this rope. Mission Control, meanwhile, is saying, hey, what are you guys doing? A didn't work, B didn't work. We didn't have any more plans. And Conrad, being the kind of guy he was, said, don't worry, I got it covered. And they're saying, and Mission Control is very control oriented, they don't like it going off the reservations. They're saying, what are you doing? He says, I'll check back with you in a minute. So you don't hear anything on the radio transmissions, but a lot of huffing and puffing and laughing. The 2 of them stood on the space station with the rope over their shoulders Now, mind you, it's going right across the back of their helmets and their backpack. A lot of things could have gone wrong, like, cutting off your air supply, for instance, or something. And then on the count of three, they stood up as fast and as hard as they could, and that yanked the rope, which swung the solar panel out. The rope came loose, and these two guys went flying, as Conrad later put it, ass over tea kettle into space. But they had tethers, so they were okay. And they're laughing hysterically, and the guys in mission control are just losing their minds because they see the heart rate skyrocketing. They still don't know what happened. They just hear, yeah, the panel's out, and we're off in space. So it was a great moment of daring do, not something you'd see today in space.
I mean, that is fascinating because, you said, they were walking on the outside of the space station. I think that kind of what's actually happening is a bunch of guys and a lot of expensive hardware are falling around the planet, right? That's what's happening. Yeah. You're in free fall around the planet Earth, out in the middle of nowhere, just falling. And everything around you falling, and you're trying to do this. It's not you're walking on the station, because, when we think of space stations, we talked about some of those concepts where there's artificial gravity or whatever. No, this is more like that movie Gravity with Sandra Bullock, where just everybody's flying everywhere, right?
So when I say walking, they're holding onto a rope, trying to keep from flying off into deep space because there are no toeholds or anything. It was really, really dangerous.
Yeah,
but
so it is some cowboy stuff, huh?
You get it done no matter what.
Yeah.
So, and this was a big station. It was 82 feet long, 33 feet in diameter in places. Still the largest single pressurized vessel ever flown into space. And it had a solar telescope, a whole bunch of experiments inside. They had a treadmill, they had a shower, they had a kitchen. So it was really very advanced for its day. And it was absolutely the Hilton compared to those small Russian stations, which weren't a whole lot bigger than the spacecraft they flew up to it in. One interesting side note, had a large window. And, when you talk to engineers about designing spacecraft, they hate windows because they're a point of weakness. There's an opening in the fuselage. There's a frame. Things can crack. Of course, the glass can break. They still didn't know that much about what was going on in terms of micrometeorites and orbital debris in space. The problem's much worse now, actually, because of all the junk we've left up there. And something, literally a flake of paint the size of a dime could punch right through a window.
Right.
Because of the speed involved. So there was a lot of paranoia about window, but finally the NASA psychologist said, these guys are going to be up there for a couple months at a time. You got to give them a window. So they put in a nice big window, and they hired an industrial designer named Raymond Loewy, who was famous for designing streamlined locomotives, the Avanti sports car for Studebaker. He designed the original streamlined Coke machine. I mean, he was this brilliant industrial designer. And they said, make us an interior. So in keeping with the 70s, it's got a lot of beige and burnt orange and kind of ochre yellow and stuff. It looked kind of like a kitchen from 1973. But it was very soothing, and they really liked it. And very quickly, the window became the favored place for people to hang out, and they realized it was really important for crew health. So 3 crews went up in total. The first crew that Conrad led was there for a month. A lot of that time was spent fixing it, but they did a lot of research. The next crew went up for 60 days, 59 days, and the last crew went up for 83 days. And they did a ton of really important work. They did life science experiments. They did a lot of biomedical stuff on each other and themselves. They did important solar astronomy because now you're outside the atmosphere. You can get a really good look at the sun without the atmosphere interfering with what you're seeing. In wavelengths you can't see through the atmosphere. They did a lot of Earth observation and some material science, and actually carried up a bunch of experiments that students designed on Earth because that was part of NASA's educational outreach program. And then in 1975, they were gone. And so NASA said, what are we going to do with this incredible space station we've developed? They said, well, let's boost it to a higher orbit. We'll have the shuttle going by 1979, and we'll use it again because they had months of supplies left. The thing was in great shape now. Everything was set to go. Unfortunately, the shuttle was delayed. And at the same time that happened, we had an unusually active solar cycle. And there was a lot more energy hitting the Earth than we would normally expect at that time of the solar cycle. So the atmosphere of the Earth actually expanded enough that began to drag on the station. And they're watching this thing come lower and lower in the orbit. There's no space shuttle to go up and boost it to a higher orbit. So ultimately, it re-entered in 1979, completely uncontrolled. Big thing tumbling end over end through the atmosphere. We had no way of deciding where it was going to go. So they tried to guess, but it ended up ultimately re-entering over Australia. A few big chunks fell in Australia, but most of it went into the ocean. So it was a big loss, and it really took us about 20 years to recover from that in terms of space stations, but it was an amazing program.
So now this was just because the shuttle was not ready yet.
Yeah.
And that was the only
Well,
way
that
we could.
and the fact that, like I said, the sun was more active than expected. It usually follows these predictive cycles, but this time it didn't, and it said, I'm going to throw a bunch of extra radiant energy at the Earth and watch what happens to you.
Yeah, and there's no way to actually deorbit it. That like no, they could have moved it down to a lower orbit and deorbited it intentionally, or did they not?
They had used most of the boost fuel to get up to the higher orbit they were parking it in. At that point, they didn't have enough control or enough gas to do that. So yeah, it came in relatively uncontrolled. And if you were alive then, you remember, the news media went nuts and people were selling caps with bullseyes saying, Skylab here and all that kind of stuff. It was a wild time. Let's go to slide 13, please.
So that's the end of Skylab. That's a tragic end to our first like real major space station and the biggest, right?
It was, but it set a lot of records and it gave us a really good foundation in living in space. And in a way, it kind of opened up some opportunities for the shuttle that might not have been there otherwise, because they might have used that thing for another 7 years. And since they didn't have it, they had to make other plans. And some of those plans included what you're looking at now on slide 13, which is the Soviet Union's Mir space station. This was the first modular station launched in pieces and assembled in orbit, very advanced for its time again. The first of 6 modules was launched in 1986 on a Russian rocket, followed by a number of other launches. They put it together, all worked pretty well. It operated continuously until 2001 when the funding was finally cut. And at that point, it had gotten very old and creaky, and it was becoming dangerous, actually. They had had a couple of fires. They had had a collision with a cargo vessel, one of these robotic cargo vessels that banged into it and tore up the solar panels. They had had a depressurization where the crew had to go run and hide until they could get the thing pumped back up and patched. So they had a number of problems, but in the 1990s, with us no longer having Skylab and the Soviet Union fell in 1992, NASA started talking to the Russian Federation and saying, look, let's send the shuttle up to the Mir station. We'll do an exchange of astronauts both ways. So we flew cosmonauts on the shuttle. They flew Americans in the Soyuz spacecraft. And there were 11 missions up to Mir in total. And it was great because not having Skylab forced us to cooperate with them. And it was an opportunity to do a couple of things. One, it was largely geopolitical because we were worried about what direction the Russian Federation might take. And so it was a way to pump some money into their space program, pump some money in their economy, strengthen political ties, force us to work together. And it extended the life of the space station from the designed 5 years to almost 15. It was also the first time tourists went to space. Dennis Tito flew up there for, I think, $30 million, $25 million, something like that. Had his holiday in space. But, it's again, the opening of a new frontier. And it was a very bold step, and the Russians got very good at building space stations. I mean, they really became incredibly
And this was
skilled.
the first time that there was international cooperation, and that, like, we talked about a lot of the early space stations. They had a lot of, I guess, military side projects going on. So our space station was our space station, and it was pretty secret, right? Because you talked about the normal experiments that were going on, but we were probably also doing military experiments, right?
Probably, but Skylab was pretty open because NASA is a pretty transparent organization, especially compared to the Soviet programs that time. There was one previous engagement between the two countries. In 1975, they flew the Apollo-Soyuz mission, but that was literally just 2 of our orbital ships docking up. They shook hands, hung out, ate some borscht, and came back. So that was kind of a symbolic thing. This was a real working together, and led to the next component of this, which if we go to slide 15, is once again the International Space Station. Now, this is a slide of its early configuration. This was actually started in 1984 by the Reagan administration as Space Station Freedom, but they were unable to get enough funding, as you probably know from reading the news. Every few years, NASA gets this new initiative. We're going back to the moon. We're going to take a journey to Mars. We're going to build a space station, depending on when it was. A lot of them just don't get off the ground because of usually Congress. So it went fallow for a while, but as Mir began to decay and it was obvious that we weren't going to be able to use it much longer, they sort of NASA brought back this idea of a space station and said, well, the Russians have a bunch of hardware they built for the Mir 2, the replacement for that. Maybe we can talk them into linking up with our hardware and we'll build a big international space station. So that's exactly what happened. So between the shuttle and Russian rockets, they started boosting these modules up there. The Russians were the first one. And the net result by 2000 was we had assembled this 240-foot long, 357-foot wide, monstrous machine with 32,300 cubic feet of pressurized space inside. So while no individual module was as big as Skylab, they just go on and on and on from one segment to the next. Now there's still a Russian and American side, and they each have their own protocols and their own voltage and all that kind of stuff. But it's worked, in wonderful orchestration for over 20 years.
So did they literally build off a central point, like an American module and a Russian module, and then it just moved out? So there's almost like a DMZ, right between the two, and then everything moved out from there.
And there are these nodes, so they have docking nodes that they can actually kind of tinker toy this thing together. So you can put a module on one side, and then you could dock a spacecraft on the other. And they're fairly universal in their orientation. So since 2000, there's been 239 astronauts from 19 countries up there. And recently, NASA announced that they were going to start taking tourist flights. So if you've got $50 million to pay SpaceX for the ride up there, for only about $30,000 a day, you too can live on the space station for a month. And that's basically toilet privileges and air to breathe and food, and try to stay out of the way. However, you better do it soon, because depending on what happens, it's probably going to be deorbited somewhere between 2024 and 2028, because it's getting old. Let's go to slide 16. We'll see the completed station again. It's been up there 20 years. Like I said, at this point, the astronauts spend almost half their time just on maintenance and repair. So it went from being brand new, very robust hardware to aging, tired. Still works, but you got to do a lot to keep it going. And for anybody who's interested, it goes overhead 15 times a day, and you can look up online, where is the space station, and you can find a guide to when you can go out at night and watch it go overhead. It's pretty remarkable. It's the brightest light in the sky at that point, except the moon, and it's going right overhead.
So what's their plan to deorbit it? Because I would think, because it's modular, why do you ever have to get rid of it? Why don't you just deorbit the modules that are broken or too much of a maintenance pain, and then
the problem
put another one on?
At this point, it's costing almost $3 billion a year for NASA to maintain the thing and operate it, and they want to put that money into the moon and going on to Mars. So what they're trying, one plan is to just take the modules off and deorbit them, and the Russians have said that they're already going to either repurpose and deorbit their main module, which we get power and propulsion from, in 2024. One way or the other. Now, that may be a way to say, hey, NASA, you need to give us more money to keep it up there longer. We don't know. But there's been a conversation with the private companies like Axiom Space, and when Bigelow Aerospace is still around, Bigelow, to send up private modules that would allow private companies to do things up there. Because there's a lot you can do in orbit that's very important. You can do long duration spaceflight research on human beings in zero G, which you can only do in space. There's a ton of biomedical research, human physiology factors, astronomy and astrophysics you can do up there that you can't do from the ground because you're outside the atmosphere, material science, weather research on Earth. You can do a ton of climate observation. You can get that from satellites too, but they do some from the space station. They've done a lot of growth of crystals and a lot of metallurgy research up there. And there's a fiber optic called Z-band that you can only make in space. It's about 10 times as effective as what we use now, because it's not being affected by gravity when it's being manufactured. So these are some of the things these private companies are looking at. So they'd start by hooking up to the space station and getting their power and water and living arrangements and all that from the station. But then gradually, as the space station is taken apart and decommissioned, they would stay up there as free flyers and bring up more modules of their own. So they're trying to do this gradual transition over to the private sector. How successful that'll be, we're not sure. But, often in this conversation, what comes up is a lot of questions about, well, what's the point? We got these people, hey, yeah, we know you want to do research and long duration space flight because want to go to Mars someday and all that, but really, what's it matter to people on the ground? Well, increasingly, they're doing research on human tissue. So they've solved a lot of problems about how wounds heal, making that better and cleaner. There are certain applications for tissue growth that you can only do in orbit. So they're doing an experiment. They just took up, in fact, in the SpaceX capsule that just went up, some heart tissue samples that they're going to try and clone. So ultimately, there's a thought that there will be a thriving business in growing human organs in orbit and bringing them back and prolonging people's lives. One of the big questions that still hasn't been worked out is, can human reproduction be effective in zero G? Yes, you can have sex, but will a baby gestate properly and be born normally? We've never done it. We've never even done it in partial gravity because you can't create that on Earth. So we don't know if you can have people living and reproducing on the moon where it's 16% Earth gravity, or Mars where it's about 38%. So the only place you can do that is in space. So short of doing it on the moon or Mars, you get a smaller centrifuge and you rotate a bunch of mice and you get a couple of them pregnant and see what happens. So that's the kind of stuff they're trying to do now while it's still there. There are some big problems of being in space over the long haul. It's very tough on the human body. Space hates people, basically. Let's go to slide 17, please. Here's some astronauts in the ISS doing some biomedical research. We're big bags of meat and water. You know, we don't like being in a vacuum. We don't like having our sunlit side be 250 degrees and the shadow side be minus 250. We don't like being in radiation. Space is just crackling with radiation. The space station is protected for most of it by the Earth's magnetic field. But, you know, it's still a very harsh environment. And they found over the long term, because we've had people for up there for more than a year at a time, especially the Russians, the bones weaken. Even if you exercise a couple hours a day to try and keep them strong, the bones weaken. All the fluids in your body shift towards the center and clog up your head, so you can't taste anything. You have trouble hearing and seeing straight. The eyes change shape and begin to lose focus. For some reason, only happens to men. No idea why. Sometimes it reverses itself when you come back to Earth. Sometimes it doesn't. They did that recent study where Scott Kelly was up there for a year and his twin brother, who's also an astronaut, amazingly enough, Mark Kelly, stayed on Earth. So they had a control organism on Earth. So they did a year in space with Scott, a year on the ground at Mark, and kept taking blood samples and doing MRIs of these guys. We're able to see now really what the specific changes are. Turns out that the telomeres, which are part of your genetic structure that control aging, actually begin to extend themselves in space. And we thought for a little while there, maybe it'll cause us to live longer. But it turns out when you come back to Earth, gravity causes them to shrink up again. So that's kind of a non-starter. But there's still a lot of work to do up there. The main goal is we got to figure out, if we're going to go any further than the moon, which is a couple days away, we got to figure out how to exist in zero G for months at a time without becoming incapacitated, because it takes 5-6 months to get to Mars and the same amount of time to get back. And if we're going to do that, we got to figure out how to keep people from dying.
And out of all the space stations, we still haven't gotten to the circular centrifugal space station.
Nah.
Nobody, and have there past the science fiction or I guess early ideations of this, have there been any serious plans to build a space station that spins?
There's been a lot of NASA studies. There's been a lot of private corporations looking at it. The problem is just one of mass and machinery. You know, it's not that we don't understand and don't have the technology to do it. We just have not yet been able to put the funds together to make it happen. And it's also one of the things that's coming out of the space station research is we're discovering that we either need to figure out how to protect ourselves from space or how to adapt so that we're better at being there, right? And if we're going to go beyond Earth orbit, we've got this other bugaboo, which is radiation. There's a ton of radiation coming from the sun. There's even worse radiation coming from outside the solar system from other stars that's highly charged heavy particles, and they just tear up your DNA. They cause cancer. They cause cognitive loss of function, we think. We think they cause cardiovascular damage. It's just bad. So you need these things to be light enough that you can include shielding to protect people. Aluminum doesn't do it. You have to have other kinds of shielding because when a high energy particle hits an aluminum spacecraft hull, it actually splits when it comes out into 10 particles. So it's actually worse inside the spacecraft than outside. So they got a lot of stuff to work out. So the whole creating gravity in a spinning construct thing has kind of been a secondary consideration, but it's talked about a lot. It's just a matter of really committing to it. They did one experiment during the Gemini program where they ran a tether from a Gemini spaceship out to a spent rocket stage and set up a very slow rotation around a center axis, and were able to prove that that whole idea of very low centrifugal gravity would work, even though the numbers are very low. So we know it can be done. It's just a matter of putting together the machinery to do it.
So everything you said, it's mass, right? And mass is money in space.
Yeah, exactly. It's really expensive to launch stuff. However, here comes the new space age. We've got SpaceX. We've got this crazy billionaire who said, I'm tired of waiting for you guys to go back to the moon and Mars. I'm going to do it myself. And against all odds, he did. It's a little more complicated than that, because once Elon Musk proved that he could make his rockets work, he started getting NASA contracts. Then Jeff Bezos, at the same time, started his space company, Blue Origin. He's building rockets. He's not showing as many results as Musk is, but he's also developing the biggest rocket engines that have been made in this country for 50 years. So there's a lot going on in the private sector from these guys who said, I'll just do it myself.
And what was
when they joined with NASA,
like at the end of the day, how much money did he save? Like what was the factor that he made it cheaper by?
depending, now these are NASA's numbers, okay? These came from internal studies. Depending on what part of the program you're looking at, it's between 1/2 and 1/10 of what it would have cost by traditional methods.
Holy
now,
crap.
NASA doesn't build their own hardware. They always hire contractors to do it, but they used to do it on this cost plus basis you and I were talking about before, where we say, okay, we'll pay $6 billion to build the James Webb Telescope. Well, by the time it's done, it's 10 or 12 because you had cost overruns and problems. The new contracts that they have with SpaceX and Blue Origin and a few other companies are fixed fee. So here's the money you get. And if you can't prove to us there's a really good reason you're going over budget, it's on you. So now these guys have their own skin in the game and they're really motivated to make it work. And Elon Musk in particular has just transformed this business. This is the age of capitalism and space flight. Designed to build his own rockets, designed to build his own space capsule, got some NASA money, but it was always after these things were pretty much already done and proven out. And he has shaken up the launch business. He's launching more than half the world's payloads.
So that's interesting. And you called it the capitalist age of spaceflight. So what was it before when they were operating on the cost plus basis?
Entirely government supported.
And that's interesting. So Elon Musk is either an amazing businessman or, he's leaving that on the table. I don't know which it is, right? Because, those cost plus contracts made a lot of companies a lot of money, right?
Yeah, they did. And that's one reason Musk has not allowed SpaceX to go public, because he doesn't want a board of directors telling him what to do.
Take cost plus contracts? You make more money if you have a cost plus contract, right?
You would, but you know what? He and Bezos both are very philosophically driven. Bezos said in his high school graduation speech in 1982, I want to send humanity out to colonize the solar system, and I want to get heavy industry off of Earth so that it can return to its pristine state. There are ways to do that, at least in theory. Musk just said, I want to go to Mars. And he started building hardware to do it. It was really an uphill struggle. He wanted to bid on Air Force contracts. Now, the Air Force was still paying another unnamed aerospace company $1 billion a year just to be on standby. That didn't include any launches. That was just to be ready to do national security launches if they were needed. Musk wanted to bid on that, and he said, look, I'll save you 50%. The Air Force said no. So what do you do when you want a client? You sue them. So he sued him. And he won the right in court to bid on those contracts, and now he's flying half their stuff. So, and we just saw this amazing launch, Crew 1. It was the first operational launch of the Crew Dragon up the space station. That's slide 18. And it's a crew of 4. That capsule can hold up to 7 people. I've been in it once, just for a few minutes, but it's almost as big as a flight deck of the shuttle. And because it's glass panel displays with just a few push buttons for critical function, there's all kinds of room in there. It's a really sexy spaceship, and it's being done at a price. After that, he's got the Starship, which is an order of magnitude larger and more capable than that. So we're finally flying after the retirement of the shuttle in 2011. For 9 years, we couldn't fly American people on American hardware to a largely American space station. We had to hire the Russians.
Say that again, because I think that's important. So for 9 years, say it again, for 9 years, America could not put astronauts in space. Did I get that right?
Yep. We had to do it with the Russian spacecraft, the Soyuz, which let's not forget, the Soyuz was designed to beat us to the moon in the 1960s. It was the competition for Apollo. They just kept making it better and better. We abandoned our old hardware. So it took Elon Musk to bring back this return to a gumdrop shaped space capsule that's very simple, very safe, safer than the shuttle, cheaper than the shuttle. In 2011, we went to the Russians and said, hey, we want to buy a ride on the Soyuz. And they said, no problem, 36 million a seat. That was cheaper than the shuttle. That was a pretty good deal. By the time they bought the last tickets last year, it was almost 90 million a seat, because when you got the only ride up to orbit, you're going to charge whatever you want, right?
Right.
So the Russians are in pretty good shape. Now we got SpaceX delivering astronauts. We're soon going to have Boeing delivering astronauts on their spacecraft, which is called the Starliner. And the Russian program's in bad shape because they're missing all that revenue. So
is that Soyuz still, because from an engineering, like I'm an engineer, and I know from an engineering standpoint, that Soyuz is like an amazing piece of hardware because it's got 40 plus years of iteration and improvements on it. Yeah. Like that's a reliable piece of hardware. So what is their, like they're charging us $90 million, but if they got competitive with that, what do you think their cost would actually be compared to the cost of like the new Dragon?
Yeah. I've heard estimates that the amount we were paying for one seat at 90 million probably covers their entire cost for the whole flight.
Okay.
So their guys get the ride for free.
Okay.
So it's we're on a better trajectory now. Plus the Soyuz is locked into a very old design. It's 2 modules, an orbital module and a reentry module. It's a good design and it's been very robust. And like you say, it's been refined to the nth degree, but it's kind of running up against its time limits. You know, there's only so much you can do with that. We've learned a lot since then. And the Crew Dragon, the SpaceX spacecraft, takes advantage of all those lessons.
Right.
So let's admit that we're going to have to deorbit the space station pretty soon. What's next? Let's go to slide 19. We are hoping that private industry will take over low Earth orbit with private space stations, and NASA will pay to do the things they want there. NASA's next target is to put a space station around the moon called the Lunar Orbital Platform, or the Gateway. There's been a lot of iterations of this. The Russians were going to work with us, then they weren't, then they were. The Europeans were, then they weren't. Now they are again. It's unclear who's going to build all the modules, but they've got a couple under contract already. So this thing is designed to go into what they call a rectilinear halo orbit, which is kind of a weird, if you're looking face on from Earth, it's going around the moon in profile to you. And it's fairly high. It's not ideal for flights down to the surface, but it's ideal for scientific reasons, and it's also optimized for what we can actually do with the amount of mass we can throw up there.
So that orbit, that would also allow continuous communications with Earth, right?
Yeah, and polar trajectories, which is important if we want to get to the water on the South Pole, which we know we do. So that provides a long-term presence around the moon. It gives us a research platform, probably only be crewed for about a month at a time, a few times a year, because you don't want to leave people out there soaking in radiation for a long time, because we still haven't worked that out. But it's kind of the step between here and Mars. We got a lot of work to do, as I said, before we take off on a Mars journey with a crew. And this gives us a chance to get experience out by the moon. We got breakdowns. You're 2 days away from Earth. If you've got a serious illness, you're a couple days away from Earth. If you have a lunar base in a few years, you can hop down to the lunar base, or the lunar base can evacuate up to the orbiting platform. So there's a lot of things that this is good for. You hear a lot of controversy about it. There's some people that say, stop messing around with the moon. Let's go straight to Mars. But from everybody I've talked to who is good at this stuff, they really feel that it's the better part of caution to really get our feet solidly on the moon. There's another reason to go to the moon, which is we now know there's a ton of water at the South Lunar Pole in this form of ice deposits, and a lot of water incorporated in lunar rock, along with oxygen and metals and obviously silica. So we want to be able to get to that water, process it. Now you've got water for free up there. You can make breathable oxygen. You got drinking water. You can make rocket fuel out of it. So instead of hauling up all this mass, it costs about $10,000 to lift a couple of quarts of water off the surface of the earth. Next thing you know, you're drinking it, and you know where that goes. I mean, you're going to recycle it, but still.
You're going to drink it again.
Yeah, it's dumb to be spending that kind of money to launch stuff when you've got it all sitting on the moon for free. And that's why the Chinese are facing us down, and we're both rushing to try and get to the South Pole as quickly as possible to prospect and begin mining this, because once you've got water on the moon, the rest of the solar system is a quick step in your backyard. There's hardly any gravity well there, so you're not launching all this heavy mass out of the Earth's intense gravity well. You're just popping off from the moon, and now you can go wherever you want. Where would that be, you ask? I'm glad you asked. Let's go to slide 20, our last one. Next step, Mars. This is a picture of a Lockheed Martin concept called the Mars Base Camp. There's been a few different ideas. This is one of the more developed ones. It would be part spaceship and part habitat, and it would fly out to Mars with no crew in it, probably with solar electric engines or maybe a nuclear engine, and on a long, slow trajectory. And then the crew would fly in a separate spacecraft with a big chemical rocket so they can get there a lot faster, because we don't care if the machine soaks in radiation for months, but we don't want the people to. This would be an orbit around Mars. The first step, landing on Mars is going to be tough. Mars is a really crummy place to land. It's a great planet to go to, but it doesn't have enough atmosphere to slow you down very well, but it's got plenty of gravity to bring you down fast and hard. So it's hard to do. We've done it with robots, but once they get over about a ton, it's very tough. Ton of weight. So we think it would make sense to have an orbital station first. That would allow us to explore Phobos and Deimos, probably resources on those two moons we can use, the moons of Mars. And then from there, we begin making sorties down to the surface. And again, with having an orbital station, you've got a place to stage from. You can have the landers there, you can have a fuel reservoir there, and now Mars becomes something you can do on a regular basis instead of just one quick visit like we did during the Apollo years. After Mars, there's talk about prospecting and mining the asteroids, some of the large asteroids that come in near Earth trajectories. There's talk about stations in the outer solar system. Again, radiation and travel time is a problem, but we're looking at nuclear-powered drives again, which would get us there much faster. And there's even been talk about putting stations, they're not orbiting stations, but stations up in the clouds of Venus. Venus is a horrible planet. It's kind of the trailer park of the solar system. It's like 900 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface and 1,000 times, atmospheric pressure. It's just a nasty, nasty place, 1,000 pounds per square inch. But it's a good place if you're up in the clouds. There's a point of equilibrium there, but the pressure is about the same as Earth's atmosphere at altitude. And the temperatures are balmy, 70, 75 degrees. You can't breathe the atmosphere, but with a big tank of just air in it, because that atmosphere is thick enough that that's buoyant, you could actually hang a big settlement from that. Recreation be a little limited because you can't go down the surface of the planet, but if you want a research station in the Venusian clouds, you can do that. So this is all on the table. We'll see what's going to happen. First, we need to really develop this entrepreneurial approach, because by any measure, it really appears, we've got China coming up as a national program. We've got India coming up as a national space program. They're very nationalistically driven, like we and the Soviets were in the 60s and 70s. But ultimately, countries, these great powers, seem to run out of steam after a certain point. You prove your point. You developed your aerospace industry in a very robust sense. And you just can't rationalize spending the money anymore. And you need to find a way to make money in space. And the way to do that is to develop an infrastructure in Earth orbit and between here and the moon, start harvesting these resources, selling tickets to orbital resorts is one path, harvesting these resources. There's more platinum in one asteroid than there is in the entire planet Earth. You can see how they might bring that down the ocean and pluck it up later and sell it. Of course, it would crush the platinum market, but you'd be rich for a minute. So there's a lot of ways to make money out there and do good things. And ultimately, it's just going to make sense for the human race to expand and settle the solar system. And these are the steps we have to take. So
what do you think the next big step is going to be, and when do you think it's going to happen?
Well, I think the next big step is getting people back to the moon. There's always arguments about should we send people or robots. There's a group called the Planetary Society that's very much like the National Space Society. We're the human exploration advocates. They're the robotic exploration advocates. We get along, but there is some tension there between, no, we ought to send robots. And we're saying, no, we ought to send people. The truth is you need to send both. The robots go where it's dark and scary and dangerous. They do the early exploration and prospecting. Then people follow, and they work faster and better and make intuitive leaps that even AI can't do yet. So I think both those things need to be implemented on the moon. We need to get in orbit. We need to get back down to the surface. We need to start exploring these water resources. And if you want to live on the moon or Mars for the long term, again, there's that nasty radiation problem because their atmospheres aren't worth much. You want to be either in a lava tube or a lava pit, which is like a crater below the surface. And we found lava tubes that we think are about the size of the city of Philadelphia inside. So you can actually build colonies down below the surface. So that's really a good interim step because now you've got a safe, secure place. It's got a smooth floor of lava. It doesn't have much moon dust in it, which is very hard to deal with because it's sharp and toxic to the lungs. It's like asbestos dust almost. Mm-hmm. And so you start out building that lunar infrastructure, that lunar settlement, and then Mars makes more sense. I would be thrilled to see an expeditionary mission to Mars while I'm still alive. But I think if you want to get serious about settling there and setting up permanent outposts, you just have to do the moon first. So that's what makes sense to me.
All right. Sounds good. Hey, you ready to take some questions?
I am ready for anything.
All right.
I think.
So Andy, I'm sure we have some questions in the chat here.
We sure do. Thank you to everyone for tuning in tonight. I know we were a little bit late in starting, but we hope you like the new setup. Comment in the chat if you like the new setup. First question comes from Matt Nadu Man. And Nadu Man wants to know what's more dangerous potentially. I think he's referring to government or privately funded space exploration.
I guess another way to, did you hear the question? What's more dangerous, government or private? I guess who has the better safety record, government or private? And I guess we'd have to take that across both manned and unmanned because private is just now getting into. Well,
the only private unmanned exploration we've had has been, at this point, satellites in Earth orbit. And they've been very successful. So communication satellites are very reliable and a lot of money's been made on those. But when it comes to safety, we don't have a lot of experience yet. Nobody's flown on the Blue Origin New Shepard yet, which is a tourist rocket for suborbital flights. We had that one crash of Virgin Galactic that they recovered from. We're still trying to figure out how the regulation should be put together because you don't want to be too restrictive, but you also don't want to let people get killed if you can avoid it. And there's a lot of questions about liability. Even if I sign a waiver to go up on a SpaceX rocket, if I get blown to smithereens, if you're a lawyer, the waivers are barely worth the paper they're written on. So somebody's going to try and punch through that waiver to sue that company.
Right.
So, but at this point, I'd say we're at the sweet spot. NASA and SpaceX and NASA and Blue Origin and NASA and the other private contractors like Boeing are very integrated. So NASA oversees everything. They inspect constantly. If they smell something that isn't quite right, they go in and insist that it be done properly. So I'd have to say at this point, there really isn't a difference. You're never flying on a NASA rocket. It's always built by a bunch of contractors.
Right.
So it's really the relationship between the two you're talking about. I think there's a little more risk as we start to loosen up the regulations because private industry will try to cut corners. One of Elon Musk's rockets blew up a couple of years ago because of a part that he had subcontracted out. Turns out it was sublet to a Chinese company. It was made out of inferior metal and a bracket broke and a tank came loose and the rocket exploded. And at that point, he said, I'm making everything from here on out, period. Total vertical integration. So, as long as they're doing it right, I think the safety of both will be pretty high, but people will die. It's a dangerous thing.
And it still is a dangerous thing. It's not like commercial air travel.
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet. Well, hopefully it will be in someday, right? But as of now, it's still very a risky endeavor to go to space.
It is. I have to say, one of Musk's ideas is, and I keep citing him just because he's pushed so far out in this, he wants to get an assembly line going. He wants to mass produce his next rocket, which is the Starship. And it looks like a big sci-fi silver rocket, can carry up to 80 people, 100,000 pounds of cargo. It's huge. It's a big, complex thing. It's a big bite to take out, but he's showing that he's making very good progress so far, slower than he'd like, but good progress. But if you go to SpaceX down in Hawthorne and you walk in the plant, and here this huge workshop opens up before you, and off to the left are a half dozen first stages, and off to the right are 30 rocket engines, and over here are 3 Crew Dragon capsules. It looks like the GM of rockets. I mean, I was delirious. I was so thrilled, because you go to a NASA facility and they're usually working on one rocket, one lander, one spacecraft, one, very carefully with the shuttle and all that. This guy's throwing rockets together like they're going out of business, and it's just enough to get the job done right. So I saw, you're an engineer, you'll appreciate this. There was a woman up on a stepladder with a grinder, like you'd use to grind down your damage on your car, grinding on the interstage of a rocket for an hour. And I looked at the engineers giving me the tour, and I said, "Is that how you do mass reduction?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Did you learn that from the Russians?" And she said, "Yeah." Because normally you'd go in there with a router, a steel milling thing, and cut little triangles out of it, and spend hundreds of thousands of man hours doing that at great expense. But if you're on a fixed fee contract, you just get a grinder and make it thinner. That's how they do business.
Well, it's interesting too, because another, like the Russians, right? It's iteration, right? Which is important for the engineering design process, is that that you iterate. And the more times you iterate, and well, you're an editor for a magazine as well, right? The more times you rewrite, the better it gets. Every time you do it again, it gets better. It gets better. It's better. So the fact that they have so many rocket engines, they've done it so many times already, even though they've only been around for a handful of years, it's much faster progress. And you get to
it.
It,
cost less.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. All right, next question, Andy.
And now they're 3D printing parts and all that, so the costs just keep coming down and reliability keeps going up.
Yeah.
Next question comes from Larry Stern. Thank you for the question. How did you get to sit in the Dragon?
How'd you get to sit in the Dragon? Editor of Astra magazine right here.
I was working for a website called space.com, which is my favorite go-to for daily space news. And they sent me down on a press junket. So that was my first time there. So I was, penned in with 50 other journalists. And you could barely breathe in those things, right? Because they literally had a corral built. We were squeezed in there. So we're like this. But I was just close enough to the gate that when they opened it up, I was able to get an early look inside. And, I got about a minute in there before I was shooed out. But then I wrote a book in 2016 called Space 2.0 about the new space age. And I got to go back down and interview the president of the company. And while I was there, they gave me another tour and let me see some stuff. So that was the fun look, because I got to hang out and it was just me.
That's cool. All right, let's take one more question here.
One more question from the chat. Would you mind telling us a bit about the boat that you're in?
Oh yeah, you're in that boat. So everybody can see. You are in a boat, right?
Yes. It's a 42-foot pacemaker. It was a competitor to Chris Craft and Hatteras and some of the others. Built in 1973. It's got 2 diesel engines that are each about the same weight as my old Triumph TR6. They're just massive hunks of metal. But the people that owned it had loved it to death. And this is for the mariners in the crowd, if you don't mind me going off for just a moment.
It's quite
I was having it surveyed. The surveyor's walking around going, "How much is this?" And I said, "It's like $20,000. He said, "This isn't bad." We went in the back cabin, so it's got an aft cabin. It's probably about 400 square feet total. And he lifted up the bunk where the diesel fuel tanks are. And he said, "Do you know what you're looking at?" And I said, "A repainted fuel tank?" And he said, "No, a replaced fuel tank. And putting these 2 fuel tanks in is about half the cost of this boat. So I think you'd better buy it, because if you don't, I will." So I was sold. So, I've been living down here in South San Diego Bay for 7 months, and I'll probably be here for another 4 months until the vaccine's out.
You're going to keep the boat though, right?
Oh, yeah.
Or are you going to sell it for 60 grand?
No, I'm going to keep it, because the best part is I bought it from a single book royalty check.
Wow.
We authors, unless you're a bestseller, you just don't get royalty checks anymore. But I did a book on Apollo 11 last year. Buzz Aldrin was kind enough to write the foreword. People weren't buying it because of my name; they were buying it because of his name. Yeah. And I got a nice big fat royalty check. And next thing I know, I had a boat.
Very nice.
A fair trade.
Buzz Aldrin is one of our few honorary members of the club too.
he is one of the most amazing people I've ever met.
Yeah.
You know, you sit down to talk with him, and it's like there's five brilliant minds all competing for the same mouth. But this stuff that he comes up with just blows my mind. And interestingly, he is very, very, I interviewed him a few months ago for one of our articles, because he's also on the board of governors for the National Space Society. He's been very active with us. He is really pro-China in terms of trying to, he understands the political issues, he understands the technology transfer stuff, but because Buzz's brain is always 30 to 50 years out in the future, he realizes it's inevitable that if we don't cooperate out there, we're going to beat each other's throats. And he's really actively working hard to get cooperation to happen. So,
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at their GDP, they're coming up. There's no denying it. You know, they're there. So,
and they plan 10 years out, so they don't have these reversals every 2 to 4 years where
Yeah.
we cancel. We have canceled more programs than we've actually carried out in terms of big, ambitious human spaceflight.
yeah,
So if we could plan 10 years out, or in this case, you have a president for life in China. I'm not advocating that for the U.S., but if we could just lock up a 10-year plan, we could do the most amazing things, especially now.
yeah. Well, hey, Rod, thank you for coming by, or not. Thank you for joining us. I guess that's the right way to say it, right? And we'll hope we hope you come up here when we're open again after we have this pandemic behind us, and you can be our guest at the club and claim your free dinner and all that.
I'm really looking forward to it. It's been too long. You guys are a great bunch, and I really enjoy it.
All right, thank you very much.